Hello and welcome back, and that is right, we're doing our Plex media server testing of the brand new silent NAS, the HS-264. You guys have seen me do this before, you know how it goes. We test some 720p, some 1080p, and we test some 4K high dense media. Now, if you've not watched this series before, I am going to be utilising very different file formats, and I will be going into a little bit of detail about the difference between certain formats, codecs and compression techniques. Although I will mention early doors on the bat here, got a bit of a sore throat, so I apologise if I'm coming across ever so slightly gravelly there. I'm also recording this just outside of the studio while Eddie the web guy is taking some photos for another unit for a review coming up soon that I can't really tell you guys much about. So if you hear a camera clicking in the background, that is me. But let's go ahead and start going through this setup. As always, we take advantage of several things. We take advantage of some movies that we've got ready in our Plex Media Server collection there. We've got some 1080p movie and a 720p movie, and then we use those jellyfish files, which are the same 30-second file, but getting heavier and heavier in its volume there, starting at just 10 megabytes, going all the way up to a dense 4K 400 megabits per second bitrate, 4K UHD HDR H.265 file at 1.4 gig, and that's the same 30-second file. Now, the NAS we're utilising today takes advantage of a newer generation Celeron processor, the N5105, and it's a 4-core processor there that can be have its processing speed up to 2.9 GHz. It's also got 8 GB of memory by default. We are accessing this NAS on a local area network, and we are of course utilising a Plex pass account there. And again, we are going to take advantage of hardware transcoding, but without further ado, let's crack on with stage 1 of our tests. Okay, so our first test is taking advantage of that old grateful favourite, The Matrix. We're just going to pretend the most recent release didn't happen. We're going to go ahead and go straight into this file. We're going to disable any kind of audio there because of the YouTube bots. But as you can see, the file is playing at its original 720p, and that's 0.7 megabits per second there. Now again, it's playing at normal performance there. We are taking advantage of OBS for our screen recording there, so that may have its impact on the frame rate for you guys watching, but don't worry, it's coming through clear as a whistle. On the right hand side of the screen, you can see the CPU and memory utilization. It's going to be important to monitor this so we can see just how this NAS reacts to some of the denser files. Next thing we do, of course, is we flick around the file nice and quick, making our way around the movie, and again we are watching this on the local area network, so as you can see there with the remote access tab there being off. The reason we do this is because a number of you are going to enjoy large collections locally, and we're trying to kind of utilize this just to test its file format natively. When it comes to you guys that want to access remotely, what we do is we then activate transcoding. With the transcoding, what we're doing is we're emulating and simulating different kinds of access conditions, whether that is that you're accessing it on a smaller device that may or may not support these file formats and needs to change them on the fly, or you're using limited data connections and therefore you're going to be having the file resized to be better suited to a slower or limited data connection. So the first thing we're going to do is knock this 720p file down to 480p, and that was an instantaneous change there. As we can see, flicking along, we're still able to make our way around the file. As you can see from zooming in, we're now converting down to 480p. So let's do something a little bit more extreme, and we're going to lower the quality of this file down to 160p, otherwise known as potato quality. Now, this can take a little bit more This is a big jump, and 160p has got significantly fewer pixels, but at the same time, these files and frames are being changed live. And as you can see immediately, the CPU has leapt into action there on the right-hand side of the screen. Once again, for those watching this video and querying who is ever going to watch a 160p file, nice and simple. It's people that are using limited data connections, that are watching low-res files, or using files that they're more interested in the audio, but ultimately we're just trying to simulate limited access conditions. But the file is playing fine. If we skip to a new scene, again we're seeing nice fast transitions, we're seeing bumps there on the CPU, and this is something I would expect a NAS like this to comfortably be able to perform. I think this NAS should be absolutely fine with the bulk of 1080p content. I just think we may hit hurdles when it comes to HDR content or HEVC, highly efficient video codec content. But for now, let's wrap things up on the 720p file. We're going to head back into the films. And now we're going to look at a 1080p, slightly higher bit rate there. This is Little Shop of Horrors. Once again, even if you think you've watched this movie before, make sure you've watched the original cut with the different ending. It's insane. But for now, as we open up the guidelines there, you can see we're playing at the original 1080p at 1.9 megabits per second. And the CPU is having an absolute ease of a time. It's not even stretching its muscles. There isn't a bead of sweat on its forehead. If we fast forward, absolutely fine stuff. We can skip back and forward in this file that we're accessing remotely. Everything's absolutely fine and dandy. So now we're going to transcode this 1080p down to 720p, and we're increasing the bit rate there to 4 megabits. But again, absolutely fine. 1080p, change to 720, playing like a dream. As we see, the CPU doesn't care, doesn't give a hoot. So now let's make our way down to 240p. 240p, again, these are the ones where the CPU has to work a little harder and it's not as instantaneous because you are changing a lot more than a simple screen ratio. And as you can see, CPU ratio during that initial change there, quite high. We should see that curve start to come down, but ultimately that transition there, it's always going to be tough, even on higher end CPUs. It's how long it takes to perform that action that's a real kicker. I should also add, while it's doing this, that this is a NAS CPU that has embedded graphics on board, and therefore those embedded graphics mean that there is a portion of the CPU component that is dedicated to graphical manipulation, OpenGL, and ultimately multimedia access. So it's CPUs that have got embedded graphics that you tend to find are able to handle Plex Media Server a great deal better. But as we flick around this file, we're going to see a slight delay as it has to do a lot more work to flick between those scenes, but it's still running pretty fine, but we're going to keep seeing those CPU spikes. Now, just before we move on to the Jellyfish files, I want to talk about this here. This little orange line you can see here, and the darker orange line that's in front of it. Now, more colloquially, that is known as buffering or caching. Ultimately, this is how much of the file the system has ready to roll. So as you play a file, if you're running a transcoding operation, what you find is that the system needs to prep that file for playback. And although if you play in the original format, the entire line will be light orange for played and dark orange for ready, when you're transcoding, the system can only transcode so far ahead. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up now is when we go into the more hardcore files, this little dark orange bit here is how we predominantly gauge how well these files are playing, because it tells you how well the system hardware, not only by virtue of CPU utilization, but how well the hardware is handling this file. So if we come out of Little Shop of Horrors now and make our way into the Jellyfish files for testing, what we can do from here, let's make our way into the listing method there. We want to come out of that. We want to go back into the 4K files, and we want to test these files one by one from the easiest to the hardest. Now, I mentioned earlier on about HDR and HEVC content. Now, again, if you've watched my older videos on this, you'll know this, but just in case you don't, if you do, you can fast forward a couple of minutes. When it comes to multimedia on any system, not just NASes, but phones, laptops, tablets, and more, these files need to use a compression technique. Movies and media these days is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And to compress these into manageable files for multimedia, you have to use a technique known as compression to shrink the file. But by doing that, you can lessen the quality. Now, the way that the multimedia industry has got around this is by utilizing compression techniques optimized for high density media. Now, H.264 is one of the most common, if less efficient, compression methods. It's also open. Anyone can utilize it, and therefore if you play files like this on any device, that device will be able to play that file with no difficulties and no transcoding needed. Whereas an HEVC, otherwise known as highly efficient video codec, or otherwise known as H.265, is a shared patent compression. It's actually owned by several parties, and in order to have your system fully compatible to play these files natively, that is, without transcoding, what it needs is that license, and that license costs money, either to the end user or to the manufacturer in their product. The result is that in the case of all NASes, not just QNAP, in most cases, if you try to play an HEVC file, the system will immediately need to transcode that file. It's not, even though it has the hardware to do it, it doesn't have the license to do it. And therefore, even though these two files here at 3 megabits per second are pretty much identically the same file, if we look, they're both just 10 megabytes in size, and both of these files are 3 megabits. Because one of them is HEVC, the system is going to be forced to transcode them. Now, if we make our way back in, we can play that first file like so. This first file will play absolutely fine. If you look at the bottom of the screen there, you can see that dark orange line. It's skittering ahead, and as we can see, it's converted that file by default, which is quite strange. If we go to the original quality there, the original quality playing absolutely fine there. Transcoding of that first file clearly having a bit of an impact there as we default went into the transcoding method. But for now, as you can see, it's playing that file absolutely fine. Now let's play that same file, but this time the HEVC version. If we open up the settings menu, you can see that it's immediately converted it, but you also cannot play the original version, just the converted version. And as you can also see, the system has had to use more system resources than it would have to play the file normally as an H.264. Nevertheless, it was able to play these files. Now, as we go through the rest of these tests, it's also worth reminding you that the bulk of modern multimedia released in 2022 and onwards tends to arrive now in HEVC or 10-bit media. So when you're buying any NAS for Plex Media Server in your home, again, regardless of brand, do a quick canvas of the media you own and what formats it has, because it may impact the system you use. Anyway, let's fast forward now. We're going to go on to the 10 megabits per second file. Again, we're going to play original quality on our H.264. Absolutely fine. It's just going to skitter along. It's going to keep defaulting into that transcoding method as we've simulated a limited internet connection here. So do ignore that little spike there as it's tried to transcode. What we're really looking at is the original quality here on screen. But nonetheless, this file's running absolutely fine. The dark orange buffering is running fine too. So we can come out of that there. And now we will go through every single one of the H.264 files because we need to play those back to back for a good level on how this system performs. We'll open that up. We'll cease it from converting. We want it to play its original format. And as you can see, the 1080p file now at 30 megabits per second is playing absolutely fine, and all the caching and buffering absolutely fine there. Exactly what I'd like to see. Next up, let's make it bigger. We're now going to hit 100 megabits per second H.264 here. Now again, if we play this file, let's go for it and play it immediately, we might see a little bit of struggle if we play it in the original version. We don't want to convert. This is where we're going to start to see this particular CPU reach its limits. Celeron processors, you can see the dark orange there. It's not completely shot ahead this time. And this is why we've picked a 30-second file. Because as you can see, the playback in light orange is only just being outpaced by the caching there at the bottom. Now, that gives you some idea about where this CPU may be hitting its limits, at least as far as Plex Media Server is concerned. Because if playback outpaces buffering, the obvious result is that file will have to stop playing in order to let caching catch up. Now this is going to be emulated in the next file, which is a 4K file. If we play this one, we play it as original quality, we play it there. Now watch what happens with that buffering and transcoding in our new file here. Remember, we're now playing a 4K file on Plex Media Server. We've got up to 4 seconds and the spikes appeared, but now the spike has gone down, and that means that the system has hit a bit of a wall with this file. And this is something we've highlighted in many other videos previously about playing 4K multimedia on Celeron-based NASes. 4K multimedia on these NASes requires a lot more oomph than you might think, and as you can see, it's kicked us out of that file. And while we're here, why don't we go ahead and test the 200 megabits per second H.264 file. I've never seen a Celeron NAS play this file. This is incredibly dense media at 200 megabits per second. So again, don't look at these tests as anything of a particular fail for this system, because this is not a file that this system should be geared towards playing. We're seeing the buffering as before. We can scroll to the bottom, but again, we've gone as far as that 4 to 5 second mark. We've seen the CPU spike, and as we can all about to see, the system is unfortunately going to kick us out here as far as Plex Media Server on this CPU is going to be based. Now remember, we've only been looking at those original H.264 files. We're now going to move over to just a few HDR files and H.265 or HEVC. As you can see, it's kicked us out. Now scrolling back to 1080p, let's go ahead and now play the 10 megabits per second HEVC file. Again, it's going to need to convert the file automatically. As it converts it down, we just want it to convert to a 1080p version, not a 720p. And as you can see, the buffering is taking place, but the buffering is just going to outpace that of the playback. So it's absolutely fine, but again, we're still seeing it not completely fill the void there. So if we come out of that one, we'll now move into the 30 megabits per second version. We'll open that up, convert it automatically. You can even go to the maximum conversion this time. Let's give that a try. And again, we go to the bottom. It's redoing its buffering there at the bottom of the screen. But again, look at the speed of that buffering there. I don't think this is going to do a particularly good job of outpacing playback when this system starts to play this file. If we move along as it goes, we're going to see that that playback is slowly closing in. Now, it might be okay for this 30-second file, but if this was a 60-second file, I can't guarantee that playback wouldn't outrun that buffering there at the bottom of the screen as that file plays there. And I think this is going to be largely where we live in terms of sustained playback, at least as H.265 is. Now, if we go down, now we're going to move to the 100 megabits version. Open that up on there. Convert it to the maximum, and again we can see their CPU utilization during these HEVC converting formats here has been particularly high. So again, we're just going to leave that there at the bottom. That buffering is taking place, but I'll be very surprised if this file can still stay ahead of that playback. It might do it within the 30 seconds. But I think if this file was longer than that, I think we'd inevitably see the playback outpace that of the buffering. In fact, we may see it now. We're seeing them getting quite close together. It's like those little seaside rides with the horses and the two pences. And right now, I think we're going to see the file stop playing shortly, and there you go. So that for me is the limit for this as far as this system goes for HEVC. And I'm just going to quickly throw in a couple of bits of 4K on there just to show you that this is capable of some. But these are 10-bit HDR 4K files. These are some real big boys as far as these files go. We're going to give them a quick try before we wrap this video up. Have a little look there. And I really think we're hitting a wall. We've got our buffering there. And it's going to try. Fair play to it. It's going to try. But look at how long it's taken it to buffer. 6 seconds. It's taken at least 10 seconds to take us this far. It's going to play shortly, but there's no way that playback is not going to outpace that buffering there on screen. And CPU utilization is largely at maximum. Remember, this is a system that's not taking advantage of SSDs. This is a 2 hard drive system taking advantage of WD-RED hard drives there inside for a couple of 4 TBs. But ultimately right now, I think 4K is mostly out of the question on a Celeron-based processor like this. We're just catching up. Fair play, it is doing a sterling job, and it managed to get to that 30-second mark. But again, I think I'm going to end things there. Actually, before we end it, let's throw caution to the wind. As always, as we end most of our videos, we're going to play the nightmare file. We're going to play the Jellyfish 400 megs 4K UHD HEVC 10-bit file. Again, this is a file that's only been played cleanly by 3 NASes in the last 3.5 years. So there's no, if this even attempts to play this file, I'll be impressed. So let's go ahead and play that file and end on this note. We're going to go for that convert automatically. And let's see what this can throw at this file. Again, we're going to see how much buffering it's capable of doing. The CPU looks like it's having its own special meltdown there at the top. And it is attempting caching. Fair play to it. We're up to 3 seconds. It's taken nigh on 10 seconds, but we've got 3 seconds of caching. But I think we're looking perhaps at the limitations of this box here. The caching continues, but now at 25 seconds to cache 5 seconds of footage, this is no way this would be in any way efficient to play. But fair play to it to try, and we're just going to let it stutter itself out there because it's going to try and play the file again. You know, huge respect to it trying, but of course it hit a wall there. But this has been Plex Media Server testing of the brand new HS-264 NAS from QNAP. Again, we've got a full review link to the description, as well as the review over on NAS Compares with lots of photos and information, and we have more guides and comparisons on this system coming very soon. So click like if you've enjoyed the video to help us understand what we're doing right. Click subscribe if you want to learn more about the subject of NAS, Plex and more, and take advantage of the free advice section linked in the description. It will give you more information about the right setup for you, and we can help you choose the right solution based on your budget, needs, location and more. It's a free service. We don't charge for it. You can use the donate buttons or ignore them. We do nothing with your email. It's just all here to help you. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.